Myall Creek is essential to understand who we are as a nation. And until we engage with Myall Creek and what Myall Creek represents, Myall Creek was only one of many massacres in Australia. So it's not unique to Myall Creek, but the story of Myall Creek has become representative of all those massacres. Until we engage what those massacres mean, we as a nation will never move forward. So there's a spiritual connection involved. One year at Myall Creek, there was this Aboriginal pastor, and just spontaneously, he wasn't a speaker, he was just amongst the crowd, and he cried out, and the blood went into the ground and cried out for justice. Now, I knew enough theology to understand what he was referring to. He was referring to when the old Jewish story, now Christian story, but he was referring to when Cain murdered his brother Abel. And the power of that story is that in the story it says he did that because his brother's actions were more righteous than his own. So Cain murdered his brother Abel, and the blood went into the ground and cried out for justice. And that was a summary of our massacre history. That's exactly what happened. We, Cain, murdered our brother Abel, the Aboriginal people. Their blood went into the ground and cried out for justice. But further on in the story, it goes on. It goes on when he's confronted with this murder. I mean, first of all, he says, well, am I my brother's keeper? So this immediate denial comes in, which is the pattern since those times. Still is the pattern for many Australians. But there was another element to it, which was Cain was condemned to be a wanderer. So he was given a mark to distinguish him, but he was condemned to be a wanderer on the earth. He didn't belong anymore. And if you look at the Australian record, that's what we condemned ourselves to. We, like Cain, were condemned to be wanderers. And if you look at the record in the National Biodiversity Council, a professor there was itemising the record. But he said, you know, this nation, this continent of ours with its rich mega diversity of flora and fauna, no nation in the world has been so careless in its stewardship of its natural resources. In the rate of extinctions of mammal species, no other nation in the world matches Australia. So one part of this wandering status is we're like on the surface of the earth, but we don't belong to it. And therefore we have no real connection, and therefore we don't know how to treat it. Because our motivation was land. We had a lust for land, and behind that was the empire enterprise, I call it. The real driver, I think, behind Myall Creek, racism came later, in my view. Initially it was greed. And we had to get rid of the Aboriginal people so that we could expand our economic, endeavours. But we didn't get away with it, because this stuff is like a boomerang. If you throw it out, it will eventually come back. It will hit us as well. And Myall Creek, there are 2 memorials at Myall Creek. One memorial is the one erected in the year 2000, and I'll come back to that because that's where we start to engage this history. But that memorial hall, of course, is to the fallen soldiers in World War I and World War II, or those that served. And of course, there's a connection between the two memorials, because on the altar of empire, Aboriginal people were sacrificed. The massacre of the innocents at Myall Creek. On that same altar, some 80 years later, we sacrificed our own youngest and finest on the altar of empire. Of course, what happened with Aboriginal people through this process? We told them, it's okay to kill you. Your lives are not worth worrying about. The psychological impact of that was horrendous. And there were two genocides. One was the physical genocide, and then following that was the cultural genocide that happened a century later, or during the next century. So, I mean, the interesting thing with Myall Creek is that this history becomes very tangible to you. I mean, we measure things in time. Our culture is very time-driven. But actually, you can reach out and touch these people in history like they're not far away. Remember, there's three strands here. The descendants of those who were massacred, the descendants of those who carried out the massacre, and the descendants of those who brought it to justice. But in the year 2000, when they launched or inaugurated the memorial walk at Myall Creek, one of the descendants of those who were massacred embraced one of those who carried out the massacre. You could almost miss it. But actually that embrace is the way forward for us. In that embrace, fully recognising the history, we were welcomed to country at last. And so now we have this opportunity to listen to all that Aboriginal people have to contribute. The connection to land always comes back to that. Law, community, spirituality. And of course in our culture, these are all the things we're craving. So that's why for me the Myall Creek story has such spiritual power and significance. There's another sense it has power, and that is that the immediate sense that when you go to Myall Creek, I am told that in that area, Aboriginal people wouldn't go there. They wouldn't touch it. There's too many bad spirits. After 2000, that turned around completely. And so now if you go to Myall Creek, people comment on the reverse. This place has great spiritual power behind it. But for good, for positive. I found Aboriginal people incredibly forgiving people. If I go with an attitude of humility on this story, they are always open. I find that amazing. We shouldn't take that for granted.